I was a freshman in high school on May 19th, 2005, sitting in my visual arts class, staring intently at the clock as time ticked by. Seconds felt like eons as I waited for the moment when I would be able to finally leave. That was when I saw my brother and cousin poke their head through the door and nod at me in unison. I, along with my best friend, were leaving early, cutting class to go to an opening day showing of Star Wars Episode 3: Revenge of the Sith. And at that moment, I was on cloud 9. Now, say what you will about Episode 3, or the prequels as a whole, but that experience of going to the theater and sitting with the true die-hard fans, watching the visual spectacle that Lucas and company crafted with such technical expertise, is something that will stick with me for the rest of my life. From the pulse-pounding chase sequence on Utapau to the heartbreaking confrontation between Anakin and Obi-Wan that led to perhaps the most insane lightsaber fight ever put to celluloid, all of it was amazing to see. And that is something that the Star Wars franchise has always done fantastically. The cavalcade of sights and sounds that pull you into a galaxy far, far away so completely that for the runtime of the film, you are there. And a lot of that can be credited to the amazing work done behind the scenes by the special effects teams. Teams who often had to invent all new techniques and technologies in order to achieve the fantastic feats the Star Wars films often require. The story of Star Wars and how it completely revolutionized the world of special effects actually starts over a century before the first film premiered in theaters. The world's first example of what you could argue is special effects was created in 1857 by a man named Oscar Relander, a fine art photographer from Stockholm, Sweden, who created something called a montaged combination print by combining different sections of roughly 32 different exposures into a single frame, creating the first of what we call today a composite image. Think of it as really, really early Photoshop, basically. The first instance of special effects within cinema, though, came a few decades later in 1895. Filmmaker Alfred Clark utilized a technique called the stop trick. Basically, he had his actor approach the block as if they were going to be executed, had the executioner raise his axe, then stopped filming and had everyone in frame stand as still as possible. He then swapped out the actor for a dummy wearing an identical costume and started filming again. Over the next few decades, the world of special effects would see a few new techniques brought to the table that would allow even more impressive spectacles to be created. Two such bits of visual trickery were the use of miniatures, used to create epic shots often impossible to do at full scale, and matte paintings, which is achieved by painting over a non-exposed part of a frame by hand, often creating new backgrounds and environments. Both of these techniques were utilized quite heavily by early science fiction serials, such as Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. Remember Flash Gordon? That'll come back up here in a little bit. With the advent of color came quite a few more special effects processes, including the invention of blue screen tech, which is basically replacing a specific color within a frame, usually blue in this case, with a new image. This effect, called keying, is actually something that is still used today. Kinda. It's a bit different now as we use computers to do it, but the theory is still the same. During this time, science fiction moved from being a pulp genre to one of the most popular among mainstream audiences. Films such as Forbidden Planet, a personal favorite of mine, pushed the limits of what was possible, utilizing miniatures, matte paintings, and animation to create a completely alien world. And that is largely where special effects stood for quite a while. Sure, there were a few major breakthroughs over the next few years, including the introduction of rotoscoping, which is an animation technique where artists literally draw over each frame of film, which was used to produce some of the most jaw-dropping miniature shots of all time within Stanley Kubrick's sci-fi masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. However, as the popularity of the science fiction genre died down and the 1970s loomed on the horizon, things within the special effects industry started to change. This time, for the worst. In the early 1970s, the United States entered a period of economic recession, which placed considerable pressure on the steel industry. The stock market crash of 1973 and 1974 didn't exactly help. Because less and less moviegoers had money to spend at the box office, the bigwigs at most of the major Hollywood studios decided to scale back many of their productions, leading to them closing their in-house effects departments. But a select few stuck around, taking freelance gigs here and there to make ends meet. Quite a few of these technicians even went out and founded their own effects houses, often specializing in specific techniques such as miniatures, rotoscoping and matte work, prop building, and so on. And as the 70s moved on, things started to pick up economically. The studios started to take on more and more effects-heavy projects, and soon these newly established special effects companies quickly found themselves getting more and more work. But it took the runaway success of a little film made by a young filmmaker to really jumpstart the effects industry. Enter George Lucas. Lucas was born on May 14, 1944 in Modesto, California. Growing up, he was fascinated by pretty much anything science fiction related. Comics, movies, and television programs, such as the old Flash Gordon serials, were some of his favorite things, but he also had a deep love for racing, and initially sought to be a race car driver when he grew up. However, shortly before graduating from high school, Lucas was involved in a horrific car accident that saw him ejected from the vehicle as it flipped over multiple times before smashing into a tree. Despite walking away with only minor injuries, the whole event soured Lucas on the idea of a career as a professional driver. Instead, he attended a junior college where he studied many different subjects, such as literature, anthropology, and sociology. At the same time, he also began messing around with a little 8mm camera, filming races during his free time, and developing a passion for cinema. Fast forward a few years, and the young Lucas managed to get his foot in the door thanks to a newly found friendship with filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola, who encouraged Lucas to adapt a short film he produced as a student into a feature-length film. The resulting piece, THX 1138, was met with lackluster critical reception and poor box office returns. However, it has over the years garnered a bit of a cult following. Now, not letting that stop him, Lucas went on and formed his own production company, Lucasfilm, and set to work on his next feature, American Graffiti, which upon its release in 1973 was much better received, even garnering some Academy Award nominations. After this, Lucas was on top of the world and set his sights on something he had been thinking about for a while: a large, sweeping science fiction film with epic space battles and daring heroes. That's right, Lucas wanted to adapt Flash Gordon for the big screen.
Flash who?
However, the young filmmaker was unable to obtain the rights to create the film he wanted. Dejected and unsure of what to do next, Lucas began thinking of his own science fiction universe. One combining not just ideas from his beloved childhood stories, but classic literature, historical accounts of lords, ladies, and traveling knights, and a few dashes of Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa's work. These ideas were the groundwork for what would ultimately become Star Wars. Lucas quickly threw together everything that he needed to pitch the project to major studios throughout Hollywood. However, despite the success that he had with American Graffiti, every single studio that Lucas took the idea to turned it down, figuring that taking on the sprawling space opera wasn't a financially sound business move. That is, until Lucas had a meeting with Alan Ladd Jr., president of 20th Century Fox's film division. Ladd was a huge fan of American Graffiti, and while he was hesitant to greenlight Star Wars, he pushed through a production and distribution deal for the film, which would ultimately pay off big, as it basically saved the film division of Fox from going under years later. With a deal in hand and a very clear vision and aesthetic in mind for the project, Lucas set about actually making the move. One slight little problem though. A lot of the ideas that Lucas had for this universe were extremely ambitious, so much so that many of the things he wanted to achieve with it were basically impossible given the technology of the time. Luckily, Lucas had an ace up his sleeve. Remember how I mentioned Lucas founding his own production company? Well, seeing the challenges that he was going to face on Star Wars, Lucas actually created a subdivision within the company. That's sole purpose was to create motion picture visual effects. This new division was given the name Industrial Light and Magic, or ILM for short. ILM was tasked with coming up with ways to handle some of the more bombastic effects that Lucas wanted for Star Wars. Put in charge of this was effects designer John Dykstra. In interviews, Dykstra has recounted what it was like working on the original film and the struggles they had to face, stating, quote, "Back in the days of Star Wars, we kinda walked into an empty warehouse and sat on the floor and went, how are we going to do this?" And Lucas, along with the execs at Fox, seemed to put a lot of faith in Dykstra and his team, as Dykstra stated, quote, "The producers, Gary Kurtz of Fox and George Lucas, took an incredible risk by listening to what myself and my collaborators had to say with regard to how to do this, because we were inventing this stuff from scratch." And that's not an exaggeration. While the team at ILM did utilize a lot of pre-existing special effects techniques, such as detailed miniature work and matte paintings, they also worked with all new ones, such as utilizing complex, computer-controlled camera rigs, allowing the crews to repeat the same camera moves over and over again. And remember, this was back when computers took up entire rooms still, so this was not an easy thing to achieve. And yes, it's worth noting that computer-generated imagery, or CGI, was kind of a thing at the time, and saying it was in its infancy is kind of an understatement, as the first use of it debuted in 1976's Future World, the sequel to the original Westworld. Anyways, back to the movie about space wizards. CGI wasn't exactly an option at the time, hence why the original trilogy leaned so heavily on practical effects, much to the delight of critics and audiences everywhere. And for years, the Star Wars trilogy stood as the gold standard for practical effects, a bastion showing everyone how fantastic, tangible, real objects in front of the lens could be. However, the Star Wars franchise soon saw a serious shift, as after nearly 2 decades, Lucas set to work on what would become the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Now, say what you will about the prequels, and I know that most of you watching this can probably say a lot, both good and bad, but those 3 movies managed to do some absolutely incredible things with CGI and digital effects. While yes, computer-based special effects were nothing new, as I pointed out earlier, CGI was fairly old at this point, and the team at ILM were tasked with pushing what was possible even further. Lucas had some pretty big ideas for what he wanted to see in these new films, as he wanted to show a new side of the galaxy. A galaxy at the peak of civilization. A galaxy before it was reduced to rubble and ash by years of imperial repression and all-out civil war. As such, they developed new techniques that allowed for the design, creation, and implementation of fully digital CGI environments, unlike anything seen before. All of a sudden, art departments didn't have to worry about how difficult it would be to build sets based off of some of their most out there and grand designs. In fact, they now had a significant amount more freedom to really play with what was possible, without having to worry about things such as budgets or something as pesky as real-world physics getting in the way of their ideas. I mean, just look at the Gungan city underneath the water on the planet of Naboo. That's not exactly something that would be all that easy to achieve without digital effects. And it wasn't just environments that saw limitations shattered. No longer were digital characters relegated to mere supporting and background roles. They could finally stand as a main cast member, as seen with the rather infamous Jar Jar Binks in Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Now, it is easy to forget just how ambitious Jar Jar's inclusion in the film actually was. Between just how annoying audiences found the character and the introduction of arguably a better executed digital creation not too long after. I'm of course referring to Gollum in the Lord of the Rings series, which largely built upon the same ideas and technical concepts as Jar Jar. Looking back at Jar Jar, VFX artist Owen Jackson, who has worked on such films as Alita Battle Angel and Thor Ragnarok, said in an interview, quote, "When they introduced the Jar Jar Binks character, they were confident that they could completely satisfy the audience with a full CGI character, whereas we have since learned that was not the case. Directors today are certain they can tell a story with a full CG character. Take Avatar, for instance, which was carried by a series of CGI characters. Though that was only in 2009 and it was a tremendous success, audiences of today would already note the difference in the quality of the CGI available in 2014. So utilizing a digital character like Jar Jar may have been a bit ambitious for the team at Lucasfilm back in the late 90s, but compare him to the work the team did in Episode 3 on the character of General Grievous, and it's easy to see that the team knew what they were doing. They just needed a few years to get it to where it needed to be. And that seems to be the way things work out with Lucasfilm and the special effects team behind the Star Wars films. They have a long history of devising new techniques and technologies to try to bring the filmmaker's vision to life, which is then built upon and perfected by others within the industry down the line. And in the years since the prequel trilogy wrapped production, digital effects have certainly come a long way, both in terms of technology and audience acceptance. If it wasn't for the visual spectacle that is the Star Wars franchise, the modern blockbuster would arguably not be where it is today. Sure, many might point to 1975's Jaws as the beginning of the summer blockbuster, and admittedly, they are technically right to do so, but I for one would argue that without Star Wars, big-budget, high-octane action and adventure films would not be the juggernauts that they are today. Star Wars took the idea of a massive franchise and ran with it, doing things that no one had ever thought to do before, and fans clung on to it because of not only its memorable characters and the total badassery that is the idea of laser swords capable of cutting through basically anything, but because of the series' ability to whisk audiences away to a galaxy far, far away, to take them out of their mundane, everyday lives and enrapture them completely in the excitement of it all. And without the incredibly talented men and women working tirelessly behind the scenes, inventing and perfecting ideas and concepts and technology never before seen anywhere else, I, for one, don't think any of that would be even remotely possible. Did you know that in 2001 there was a grassroots movement that attempted to get Jediism recognized as an actual religion by governments all across the globe? This actually resulted in 390,000 people writing Jedi as their religion on the UK census, making it the fourth largest reported faith in the country that year. Not really special effects related, but I thought that was a fun fact.